Why did the bar fall silent over just one word? No music, no chatter, not even the clink of glasses, just stillness. That's how it happened the moment she said it. Maverick. The rookie froze. His grin, too wide, too eager, crumbled instantly. Color drained from his face like he'd just seen a ghost. He stumbled back, eyes wide, searching for someone, anyone, who might explain why the word carried such weight. Across the room, men who had seen war in every form stopped mid-drink. Conversations ended in fragments. Heads turned, shoulders stiffened, and suddenly the corner table that everyone had ignored just minutes before became the center of gravity in Rick's Anchor bar. The call sign. Everyone in the room knew it. They knew the whispers that had followed it across continents, the classified fragments tucked inside locked briefings, the shadows of missions that officially never happened. But none of them expected it to belong to the quiet woman who sat alone, sipping her whiskey, unbothered by the silence that now swallowed the room whole. How could she be Maverick? Rick was an old place. Walls covered with fatting Navy memorabilia, photographs curling at the edges, a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Just outside the gates of Coronado, it was unofficial SEAL territory, a place to celebrate, to drink, to pretend for a few hours that war was far away. Thursday nights were always packed. Veterans leaned heavy against the bar, swapping old stories. Rookies spilled beer and laughed too loud, eager to prove themselves even here off-duty. And locals knew better than to interrupt the rhythm. Lieutenant Commander Thorne Blackwood sat in the corner with his bourbon, face weathered, quiet. He had 4 deployments behind him and no patience for rookies who thought finishing Bud S meant they were forged in fire. Beside him sat Chief Alaric Durand, a man who looked like he could disappear into his chair, and yet carried an unshakable presence. The kind of presence born from missions no one spoke of, the kind of missions that left only scars and silence. Another batch of tadpoles, Durand murmured, nodding at the rookies clustered in the center. Blackwood followed his gaze. Lieutenant Durand Mercer, 26, handsome, brimming with arrogance, stood with a beer in hand, retelling his training stories with the dramatic flair of a man who hadn't yet seen what real fear looked like. His voice carried across the room. 5 hours into the evolution, hypothermia setting in. Instructor kept saying, "Ring the bell if you want it to stop, gentlemen." Jackson was ready to quit, but I told him, "Death before dishonor, brother." His audience of rookies nodded like disciples. Blackwood only sighed into his drink. Every class had at least one Mercer, loud, eager, mistaking survival of training for mastery of war. The door opened then, letting in a gust of cool night air. A woman walked in, alone. No one gave her a second glance at first. Blonde hair tied back in a plain ponytail, jeans, boots, dark jacket. Mid-30s, athletic but not trying to be noticed. She moved without haste, no effort to announce herself, no craving for attention. Yet Blackwood noticed the small details, the way her eyes scanned exits, tracked obstacles, mapped the room in seconds. She sat in the corner, ordered whiskey neat, and seemed perfectly content with her own company. It was Mercer who noticed her next, and Mercer, who should have stayed seated, didn't. "Check out the civilian who wandered into the lion's den," he smirked to his buddy, loud enough that others heard. Durand's jaw tightened. "Leave her be, rookie. Not everyone here is your audience." Mercer ignored the warning. His swagger carried him straight to her table, leaning in like he owned the air around her. "You look lost, ma'am," he said, loud enough for half the bar to hear. "Did you know this is where SEALs hang out?" He tapped his chest where his trident would rest in uniform. "Just earned mine last month." She didn't move, didn't flinch, just sipped her whiskey. Mercer chuckled at her silence. "What brings a woman like you to a place like this, looking for some excitement?" "Still nothing." He leaned closer, pushing now, trying to pull a laugh from his audience. "Not much for conversation, huh? Just curious. What's your call sign? Oh, wait, civilians don't have those." That was the moment. The bar shifted, conversations quieted, even the jukebox hummed into silence. People turned to see what she'd do. Everyone expected her to laugh awkwardly, maybe roll her eyes and leave. Instead, she set her glass down carefully, looked him directly in the eyes and spoke. Maverick. One word, no rise in tone, no effort to impress, just calm, deliberate clarity. The effect was immediate. Mercer froze. His smirk faltered. Across the room, veterans stiffened. Drinks paused halfway to lips. Heads turned. Even Blackwood straightened in his seat, eyes narrowing in sudden focus. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Mercer stammered. "You asked my call sign," she replied, voice steady, calm as the whiskey in her glass. "It's Maverick." Mercer's eyes darted, confusion scrambling across his face. Behind him, his fellow rookies whispered, trying to laugh it off. "Maverick, like the movie," one said. "No," another corrected sharply. His voice dropped. "Like the Maverick, the one from Syria." Veteran operators nearby didn't laugh. They knew. Some straightened quietly in their seats. Others lowered their eyes, not in dismissal, but in something that looked very close to respect. "That can't be," Mercer muttered. He moved quickly to the bar where Master Chief Wesley Callahan sat, decorated, gray-haired, feared. Mercer leaned close. "Master Chief, that woman claims to be Maverick. That's impossible, right?" Callahan studied her long and hard, then turned back. "What makes you so certain it's impossible, Lieutenant?" "Because Maverick is." Mercer stopped himself. The words lodged in his throat. "Is what?" Callahan asked softly. The room waited. "One of us," Mercer finished weakly. "And what exactly do you think you're looking at right now?" Callahan's voice cut deep, sharp as a knife. Mercer's chest tightened. His bravado evaporated. He turned back toward her table, seeing her differently now, unsure, hesitant. He tried again, approaching with less swagger, more caution. "No disrespect intended, ma'am, but Maverick is a call sign tied to classified operations. If you're using it as some kind of joke—" She interrupted him, quiet, sharp, unmistakable. "Operation Kingfisher, Northern Syria, 2017. 3 diplomats extracted under heavy fire. You were briefed on the outcome but not the operator." The words struck like a thunderclap. Those details weren't in rookie debriefings. They weren't in training manuals. They belonged to people with clearance far above Mercer's. She continued, unfazed by the weight of the room. "Operation Blackfish, Somalia, 2019. 17 hostages, 0 casualties. Target never saw us coming." Mercer's throat went dry. He knew the stories. Everyone did. But they were legends, ghost tales whispered in hushed tones. And now the ghost sat in front of him, flesh and blood, sipping whiskey like she wasn't unraveling everything he thought he knew. "That was you," he whispered. "That was my team," she corrected, eyes steady. "I was just the one who got the job done." The bar had gone completely silent. Blackwood rose slowly, his posture shifting, deliberate. He walked toward her table. Mercer instinctively stepped back. Everyone watched as he stopped at perfect military distance. "Commander," she said without rising. "Captain," he replied. And with that he raised his hand in a regulation salute, in a bar, in civilian space. The shock rippled through the room like a wave. One by one, veterans rose. No words, no applause, just silent acknowledgments, subtle gestures of respect that carried more weight than anything Mercer had ever witnessed. And suddenly she wasn't just a woman at a bar anymore. She wasn't an outsider. She was Captain Everly Reed, the operator, the legend, the one behind Maverick. Mercer stood frozen, the echo of his arrogance burning like fire in his chest. Beside him, Master Chief Callahan's voice cut softly. "There's your first real lesson, Lieutenant. Never judge an operator by anything but their actions." The lesson settled heavy on his shoulders, a silence louder than any rebuke. She hadn't asked for respect. She hadn't demanded recognition. She'd just spoken her truth, and that truth had reshaped the entire room. Why didn't she leave after that night? That was the question Mercer asked himself again and again in the days that followed. If he were her, if he had shattered a room with nothing but a name, he would have walked out on a wave of silence, leaving nothing behind but whispers. But Captain Everly Reed hadn't done that. She stayed, finished her whiskey, sat in calm conversation with Commander Blackwood, as if the respect of the entire bar wasn't something she noticed or needed. And that unsettled him more than anything. Mercer had lived on validation these past months, from training instructors, from his peers, even from strangers who recognized the golden pin on his chest. He was loud because being loud made people look at him. She was silent, and the whole room couldn't look away. That night had burned him. He hadn't just embarrassed himself. He had revealed something uglier: his assumptions, his blindness, the ease with which he dismissed someone who didn't fit his idea of an operator. And he couldn't shake it. Was that really Maverick? Paxton whispered to him later that night, still stunned. Captain Reed, another rookie corrected. She commands a classified program. Everyone knows it now. Mercer just sat in silence, a glass of beer untouched in front of him. He thought about the way Blackwood had saluted her, the way Master Chief Callahan had challenged him with nothing more than a quiet question. He thought about the subtle nods of respect from men who had never shown reverence to anyone. Respect isn't taken, Mercer realized. It's given, and it had been given to her without hesitation. In the days that followed, whispers about her spread across the base. Nothing official, everything shrouded in rumor and fragment. "I heard she was Army intel before the teams poached her," one operator said. "No, Naval Academy, top of her class. They've been grooming her since day one," another countered. "She's not the first. She's just the one who made it impossible to ignore." Mercer tried to dig for more, but every time he pressed, he hit walls. Information stamped classified, programs without names, missions with sanitized reports that left out the who, the how. And still her call sign echoed everywhere he went. Maverick, it wasn't just a name, it was a myth. 2 weeks later, Mercer saw her again. It was during pre-deployment water training off Coronado. He and his rookie class were slogging through the motions, tired but still too eager to prove themselves. And at the far end of the beach, another group trained, smaller, tighter, moving with precision that caught Mercer's eye immediately. Their equipment looked different, modified rigs, configurations he hadn't seen before. Their movements were synchronized in a way that was more than just disciplined. It was purposeful, calculated. "Who's running that?" Mercer asked one of his instructors, Chief Ramsey. "That's Captain Reed's unit," Ramsey said flatly, "testing new shallow water insertion gear." Mercer couldn't stop watching. Even from a distance, the difference was obvious. Their lines were tighter, their execution sharper, no wasted movement, no slack tolerated. "They're running a tighter pattern than we are," Mercer admitted quietly. "That's because they can't afford your mistakes," Ramsey said without sympathy. "Failure in their missions means dead hostages, diplomatic collapse, political nightmares. They operate at zero margin for error. Remember that before you compare yourself." The words stung, but they also opened a door in Mercer's mind. Her team wasn't a side experiment. They weren't there because someone wanted to tick boxes or fill quotas. They were there because they had to be, because someone had decided they were the only ones who could do the jobs no one else could touch. That realization planted a seed, respect mixed with curiosity. A week later, Mercer was summoned to Commander Blackwood's office. His stomach sank instantly. He thought maybe the bar incident had finally caught up with him, that Captain Reed had filed a quiet report. Instead, Blackwood's voice was measured. "Lieutenant, I've received a training request from Captain Reed's command. She's looking for operators with adaptability, potential, not just experience." Mercer sat straighter, unsure. "Yes, sir." "Your performance in Bud S was exceptional," Blackwood continued. "But your conduct at Rick's made me question your readiness. However, your response afterward showed me something different. Growth, reflection. Reed herself noted your apology was genuine, not perfunctory. Mercer blinked. She had talked about him. So I'll ask directly, Blackwood said, leaning forward. Are you interested in participating in a joint training exercise with her unit? Understand that it will challenge more than your tactics. It will test your assumptions, your adaptability. It may change the way you see everything. Mercer didn't hesitate. Yes, sir, absolutely. Good, Blackwood said. Report Monday 600, Facility Bravo, and Lieutenant, this remains compartmentalized. Not a word to your peers. When Mercer arrived that Monday, the world shifted again. The facility wasn't like anything he'd trained in before. State-of-the-art, compartmentalized. Operators he didn't recognize moved with practiced ease. Some wore Navy insignia. Others were in unmarked gear. None looked like rookies. At precisely 600 she walked in. Captain Reed. No swagger, no theatrics, just presence. Behind her, a senior enlisted woman, strong and composed, introduced as Master Chief Zynia Blackwell. Reed's voice was calm, level, but carried to every corner of the room. You've been selected because your commanding officers believe you have not just technical skill, but adaptive mindset. That matters here more than anything. She nodded to Blackwell, who activated a screen. Complex diagrams filled the wall. Modified kill house, non-standard variables. Today you'll run extractions with restricted comms, limited visibility, hostage complications. If you rely only on your manuals, you'll fail. Mercer listened carefully, feeling his nerves tighten. This wasn't about checking boxes. This was about proving something deeper, maybe even proving something to himself. When teams were assigned, Reed paired him with Petty Officer Navarro, one of her own. Navarro's movements spoke of experience Mercer didn't have, confidence that came not from arrogance but from repetition. First time working with us, Navarro asked as they geared up. Yes, Mercer admitted. That's by design, she said simply. We do better work when no one knows we exist. Mercer tried carefully. How long has this program existed? Navarro smirked faintly. Officially, or unofficially, let's just say Captain Reed wasn't the first. She was just the one who proved the concept. The day was relentless. Hostage extractions, compromise scenarios, shifting rules that left Mercer scrambling. Every time he defaulted to what he had been taught, something fell apart. Every time he adapted, listened, considered alternatives, things clicked. During one scenario, he froze. Too many unknowns, too many risks. Reed's voice cut through the haze. What's your assessment, Lieutenant? Standard protocol says clear the entire floor first, he said, but that exposes us too long. So what's your alternative? He glanced at Navarro's equipment. Sensors, non-standard. Petty Officer Navarro's package could scan without full exposure, not standard procedure, but faster, safer. Reed nodded once. Exactly. The best protocol is the one that gets the job done, not the one in the manual. By the end of the day, Mercer was drained, but something inside him had shifted. This wasn't about lowering standards for anyone. It was about raising them. Differently, sharper, adaptive. Later, as others packed gear, Reed approached him. Your performance was solid, Lieutenant. Commander Blackwood was right about your adaptability. Mercer nodded, unsure how to respond. Then he asked the question that had haunted him since Rick's. That night, you could have identified yourself immediately. Shut me down. Why didn't you? Her eyes held him steady. 2 reasons. First, being underestimated is often an advantage in our work. Second, I wanted to see how you'd respond when your assumptions were broken. That tells me more about an operator than any metric. The words hit him like a blow and a gift at the same time. She hadn't tested his strength. She had tested his humility, his capacity to grow. And he realized then, he had been learning the wrong lessons all along. Why did her presence silence a room before she even spoke? Mercer didn't understand it at first. He had seen plenty of leaders, commanders who shouted, instructors who pushed, officers who carried themselves like their rank was a shield. But Captain Reed wasn't like them. She didn't need volume. She didn't demand submission. When she walked into Facility Bravo, the room stilled in a way that felt different. It wasn't fear, it wasn't rank. It was earned authority, quiet, sharp, unshakable. For the next month, Mercer was embedded with her unit. Alpha Team. Men and women who moved with precision, who spoke little but accomplished everything. They trained in silence broken only by commands. No wasted words. No wasted time. Their drills weren't like anything Mercer had endured before. Traditional SEAL training was grueling, yes, but predictable. Break down, rebuild, push until failure. Here, the failures weren't just physical. They were intellectual, psychological, emotional. Every exercise came with variables that shredded the comfort of doctrine. Communication cut mid-scenario. Hostages who panicked. Civilians in the line of fire. Targets who weren't who they appeared to be. Adapt or fail, Reed repeated, her tone never rising, her eyes cutting through them like glass. Mercer struggled in the beginning. He fell back on what he knew only to find it useless, clearing rooms by rote, following protocol like scripture. It left him exposed, predictable, vulnerable. But every time he stumbled, Reed didn't berate him. She didn't humiliate him. She asked questions. What did you see first? What did you miss? Why did you assume the threat would move that way? The questions dug deeper than tactics. They forced him to confront the blind spots he didn't know he had. One evening, after a particularly brutal drill, Mercer sat on the edge of his bunk, sweat still cooling on his skin, mind replaying every mistake. Navarro, his assigned partner, dropped onto the bunk opposite him. "You're not bad," she said simply. "Not bad," Mercer muttered. "That's generous." Navarro shrugged. "You're learning. That's more than most. We've had guys twice your age wash out in 2 days because they couldn't adapt. They'd rather cling to what they knew than admit they didn't have all the answers." Mercer looked at her, realizing she wasn't trying to flatter him. She was just stating fact, and somehow that meant more. By the third week, he began to see the rhythm. Alpha Team wasn't built on brute force. It was built on precision, observation, fluidity. Every operator carried different strengths, some faster, some sharper with tech, some masters of silence. Reed didn't force them into one mold. She sharpened each into what they were best at and then taught them how to move as one. It was in their differences that they became lethal. During one exercise, Mercer found himself cornered in a kill house. Lights flickered. Smoke filled the hall. Multiple hostages screamed in the dark. He froze, calculating, hesitating. "Lieutenant," Reed's voice cut through his comms. Calm, steady. "What's your priority?" "Neutralize threats," he said automatically. "Before that." He stopped, his breath heavy, then it clicked. "Assessment, environment first." "Exactly," she said. "Action without understanding is just noise." Later in debrief, she revealed the story behind the lesson. "In Somalia during Blackfish, we spent 6 hours in silence. 6 hours of watching, waiting, mapping every angle. When we moved, it took 17 minutes. Precision doesn't come from speed, it comes from patience." Her tone was casual, but to Mercer it felt like a door had opened. For weeks he'd heard whispers of Blackfish, 17 hostages, 0 casualties, and Operation SEAL legends repeated in awe. Now here she was, speaking about it as though it were simply another day at work. It struck him not the story itself, but the way she told it. No embellishment, no self-glorification, just fact, just the mission. And in that moment, Mercer understood why she commanded respect that others only demanded. She didn't need to convince anyone. Her life's work already had. Still, he couldn't let go of the question gnawing at him since the bar. Why hadn't she shut him down that night? Why let him hang himself in front of the entire bar? One evening, after training, he finally asked. "You could have ended it in a second," Mercer said quietly as she packed her gear. "At Rick's, you could have said who you were. Why let me make a fool of myself?" She paused, looked at him. Her eyes were steady but softer than before. "Because in our world, Lieutenant, being underestimated is power. And because I wanted to see what you'd do when the world didn't match your assumptions. Most people double down. Few stop and recalibrate. That's the difference between survival and failure." The answer sat heavy in his chest. He realized she hadn't been teaching him since Rick's. She had been testing him. Testing if he could change. Weeks blurred. Mercer adapted, slowly but surely. He began asking questions instead of assuming, observing before moving, listening more than speaking, and he started noticing something else, the way her operators responded to her. They didn't just follow her, they trusted her, blindly, instinctively, and it wasn't because she demanded it. It was because she had earned it one mission at a time. Mercer had grown up believing leadership was about commanding respect. Now he realized leadership was about carrying weight so heavy that others would willingly follow you into the dark. By the end of the month, his perspective wasn't just shifting, it was unrecognizable. The final week brought a briefing Mercer would never forget. They sat in the secure room, screens glowing. Reed stood at the front, posture composed, voice calm. She pulled up classified files Mercer hadn't known he had clearance for. Operation Kingfisher, Syria. The whispers, the ghost mission. What he saw wasn't the sanitized fragments he'd been fed in training. It was the raw details, the impossibility of the exfil, the political stakes, the absence of backup. She walked them through it with clinical precision, step by step, never dramatizing, never lingering on her own role. "The critical moment came when our primary exfil was compromised," she explained, pointing to the diagram. "Standard protocol called for a boarding, but a boarding wasn't an option, not with diplomats in enemy hands, not with the political fallout at stake." She stopped, looking around the room. "So we created a third option. We used infrastructure no one thought could be used. We moved where no one thought we could move. And because they never imagined it was possible, we succeeded." Silence filled the room. Mercer sat frozen. It was brilliance born not from arrogance but from necessity, not from brute force but from imagination. And then it clicked for him. Maverick wasn't just her call sign. It wasn't about being reckless or rebellious. It was about refusing to accept the box that protocol built. It was about creating possibilities when none existed. That night, lying in his bunk, Mercer couldn't sleep. He thought about the stories, about the lessons, about the quiet weight Reed carried every time she entered a room, and he thought about the man he had been just a month ago, loud, arrogant, dismissive. The shame still burned, but alongside it now was something new, something steadier. Respect. Not the kind written into manuals, not the kind pinned onto a chest. The kind you earned in silence. What happens when the theory ends and the bullets start? Mercer had asked himself that more than once. Training was one thing, rehearsed, controlled, compartmentalized. But even the most advanced scenarios still carried a safety net. In the field, there would be none. That truth hit him the morning Commander Blackwood summoned him again. "Lieutenant," Blackwood said, leaning back in his chair, "you're being temporarily attached to Captain Reed's unit for a live evolution. Observation and support only. Do not misunderstand your role. You're there to learn." "Yes, sir," Mercer said, his chest tightened. Live meant real, real meant danger. The mission wasn't officially a mission. It didn't exist on paper. A joint training operation, they called it, but everyone knew better. That night, Mercer found himself strapped into the belly of a C-130, wind roaring through the fuselage, the red light casting faces in harsh shadows. Alpha Team sat silent, each operator checking gear with the rhythm of ritual. No chatter, no jokes, just preparation. Reed sat across from him, calm as stone, eyes closed as if she were asleep. Her stillness unnerved him more than the roar of the engines. 30 seconds, the crew chief barked. The team stood as one. Reed opened her eyes. They burned sharp in the dim light. "Remember," she said, voice low, steady, unshaken. "We adapt. We don't improvise, we adapt. Stick to principles, not patterns." The light flipped green, and they vanished into the night sky. Mercer's chute snapped open, the world exploding into stars and silence. He followed their formation down into black water. The landing was rough, the ocean colder than he expected. But Alpha moved with precision, transitioning instantly into their water rigs. Mercer followed, struggling to keep pace. They approached the coastline under the cover of waves, fins slicing the water. Ahead, a faint silhouette of a compound rose against the night. He knew only fragments, a smuggling hub, suspected hostages, political sensitivities that kept this mission in shadows. Once ashore, Reed signaled silently. The team split, moving through the brush like wraiths. Mercer stayed close to Navarro, his heart pounding so loud he was certain it would give them away. The compound loomed, floodlights sweeping in slow arcs. Guards moved lazily, unaware. Mercer's instincts screamed for action. Alpha stayed still, silent, watching. Minutes stretched. His lungs ached with tension. Finally, Reed signaled. The team flowed forward. Inside the perimeter, Mercer realized the training hadn't prepared him for one thing: the weight of silence. No shouting, no dramatic entry, just precise, surgical movement. One guard dropped soundlessly. Another slipped into the dark without even a gasp. They moved through the compound like smoke. Rooms cleared in seconds. Hallways swallowed without trace. Mercer kept his weapon ready, but his finger hovered, hesitant. They were too fast, too clean. He had no targets left by the time he raised his sights. Then noise, a cry, a door slammed, hostages. The team surged toward the sound. Reed moved first, slipping into a dimly lit room where a cluster of terrified captives huddled. A guard raised his weapon, gone before he could aim. Reed was already moving to the hostages, voice low, calm, commanding their focus. "You're safe, stay quiet, follow me." It wasn't just the words. It was the way she spoke them, measured, steady, leaving no room for panic. Even in chaos, she carried stillness. They began extraction, but as they reached the courtyard, everything changed. Floodlights snapped on. A dozen armed men surged from the far end. Shouts, gunfire. Mercer's blood iced. This was it. Alpha responded instantly. Fire erupted, controlled and precise. Mercer dove behind cover, returning shots, his training clawing to the surface. He hit one, maybe two, but it was Reed who seized control of the chaos. "North wall, cut left," she ordered, her voice carrying clarity even in the storm. Operators shifted instantly, moving hostages with cover fire. She adjusted their formation on instinct, anticipating enemy angles before they appeared. A burst of gunfire chewed the ground near Mercer. He froze for half a second too long. Reed's hand grabbed his vest, yanking him aside just as a round slammed where he'd been. "Keep moving, Lieutenant," she barked, eyes flashing with focus. Her voice snapped him back. He moved, fired, covered. For the first time, he wasn't thinking of proving himself, only of surviving, of not failing the people around him. They reached the breach point, charges detonating with a concussive blast. Dust and fire lit the night as Alpha funneled hostages through, covering every angle. Reed was last, always last, scanning, ensuring no one was left behind. And then silence. They were outside, moving fast. Hostages loaded into extraction vehicles, the compound shrinking behind them. Only then did Mercer realize he was shaking. His weapon felt heavier than ever. His breath came in ragged gasps. But Alpha, they moved like it was routine, like this had been nothing but another drill. On the exfil boat, Mercer sat in stunned silence, adrenaline still searing through him. Reed checked each hostage personally, eyes scanning for injuries, voices hushed with reassurance. She wasn't just the operator who had pulled impossible missions. She was the anchor, the calm, the reason the storm didn't consume them. Mercer watched her, understanding something new. Maverick wasn't just a call sign tied to daring feats. It was about this: the ability to remain unshaken when everything screamed chaos, to bend reality to will, not through arrogance but through clarity. Back at base, the debrief was clinical. Objectives met, 0 casualties, mission a success. When it ended, Reed caught Mercer on his way out. "You froze," she said simply. Mercer's face burned. "Yes, ma'am." "And then?" "I adapted." A faint nod. "That's the point. Freezing isn't failure, staying frozen is." Her words lingered long after she walked away. That night Mercer lay awake replaying every second. The floodlights, the gunfire, the way Reed had pulled him aside at the exact moment his hesitation almost killed him. He realized then training hadn't prepared him for her clarity, her presence, her refusal to break. And a thought gnawed at him. If she hadn't been there, would he have made it out alive? The shame cut deep, but alongside it was something else. Not just respect, not just awe. Hope. If he could learn from her, really learn, maybe he could become something more than a rookie clinging to arrogance. Maybe he could become the kind of operator who didn't just survive missions, but carried others through them. And maybe that was the point of all this. Why did failure feel heavier than fear? Mercer kept replaying it in his mind. The moment the floodlights snapped on, the shouts, the gunfire, his hesitation, the round that nearly took his life would have if Reed hadn't yanked him out of its path. He survived, they all did. The hostages were safe. By every metric, the mission was a success, and yet all Mercer could feel was failure. It haunted him on the ride back. While Alpha Team checked gear and whispered calm reassurances to the hostages, Mercer sat silent, his weapon resting heavy on his lap, his chest tight with the knowledge of what he almost cost them. When they finally returned to base, debrief was methodical, objectives achieved, timeline reviewed, every action broken down. When it came to Mercer, Reed didn't scold. She didn't tear him apart in front of the others. "You froze," she said flatly. "Yes, ma'am," Mercer admitted, his voice low. "And then?" "I adapted," he said, forcing himself to hold her gaze. Reed studied him, her eyes unreadable. Finally, she nodded once. "That's the difference that matters." She moved on. The others returned to their routines, their conversations brief and quiet, like the mission hadn't rattled them at all. Mercer lingered. He couldn't shake it. He had seen her in the middle of chaos, unflinching, decisive, anchoring everyone around her. He had seen himself falter. And he hated it. That night sleep wouldn't come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every mistake replaying in merciless detail. The arrogance he'd once carried so easily was gone. In its place was doubt. But also something else. Determination. The next morning, Mercer was up before dawn. He went to the kill house, alone, running scenarios until his muscles burned. Again and again, he forced himself to move faster, cleaner, sharper. He drilled until sweat soaked through his shirt, until exhaustion blurred his vision. At some point, footsteps echoed behind him. He turned, startled. It was Reed. She stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, watching silently. He straightened, breath heavy, unsure what to say. "You're here early," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Mercer swallowed. "Because I froze." Her eyes held him steady. And I don't want to freeze again." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she stepped closer. "You will," she said plainly. "Everyone does. Combat isn't about never freezing. It's about how quickly you unfreeze, how fast you recalibrate." Her voice softened just slightly. Don't confuse hesitation with weakness, Lieutenant. Sometimes it's the mind's way of forcing you to reassess. What matters is what you do next. The words sank deep, heavier than any rebuke. She wasn't excusing him, she was teaching him. "Run it again," she said, nodding toward the kill house. And he did, with her watching, guiding not with commands but with questions. Always questions. What did you miss when you turned that corner? What else could you have done with one fewer bullet? Where was your exit point? Hours passed. Mercer's body ached but his mind sharpened. For the first time he felt himself beginning to think differently, not just following protocol, not just reacting, anticipating, seeing. By the time they finished, the sun had risen high. Reed handed him a canteen. "You're not here to impress me, Lieutenant. You're here to learn. Remember that." He nodded, too tired to speak. Over the following days, Mercer began noticing things he hadn't before. The way Alpha Team operated wasn't about individuals proving themselves. It was about trust, silence, each person knowing their role so deeply that words became almost unnecessary. Reed embodied that. She didn't command through volume, she didn't demand obedience. She carried it quietly, naturally. During one evening debrief, she shared a story that struck him harder than any drill. "Iraq, 2016, she said simply. "Convoy ambush, 3 vehicles disabled, 16 lives at risk. I wasn't the senior officer, but I was the one who moved. Not because I wanted to, because no one else did. Leadership isn't rank, Lieutenant, it's weight. If you can't carry it, people die." Her words lingered long after the room emptied. Mercer realized then that he'd spent his entire young career chasing the wrong thing. Recognition, validation, the thrill of proving himself. But leadership wasn't about proving, it was about carrying. One evening he found himself back at Rick's, the bar where it all began. But this time he wasn't holding court with rookies, basking in attention. He sat quietly with Chief Durand, listening more than speaking. "You've been different lately," Durand observed, eyeing him over his glass. Mercer shrugged, "Just processing some lessons." Durand smirked. "Captain Reed has that effect." "You've worked with her before." "First time was Iraq. She was just a lieutenant then. Convoy ambush. 16 lives saved." Durand sipped his drink, his eyes distant. "Some operators chase recognition. Others chase results. She's the latter, always has been." Mercer thought about that for a long time. About the woman who carried more weight than anyone in the room, but never sought the spotlight. About the legend who never asked to be called one. As he sat there, Reed walked past outside, her presence as unassuming as ever. She didn't glance toward the bar, didn't seek acknowledgment. But a group of junior female officers crossing the lot straightened instinctively as she passed, sensing her gravity without even knowing her story. Reed gave a subtle nod and kept walking. It was then Mercer understood something profound. Legacies aren't always built on noise. Sometimes they're built in silence, passed not through speeches or demands but through quiet example. And in that moment, Mercer realized he didn't want to be the loud rookie anymore. He didn't want to be the man who filled silence with arrogance. He wanted to be the operator who could walk through chaos the way she did, steady, unshaken, carrying the weight without needing anyone to notice. For the first time, he felt the faint outline of who he might become. Not a rookie, not a shadow of arrogance, but a soldier shaped by silence. Why him? That question clung to Mercer like a shadow. Out of all the rookies, all the operators more seasoned, more deserving, why had she allowed him into her orbit? Why had she tested him instead of dismissing him? The answer came one afternoon, when Commander Blackwood called him into his office again. "Lieutenant," Blackwood said, sliding a folder across the desk, "you've been requested for a joint training assignment. 4 weeks. Captain Reed's unit." Mercer blinked. "Requested, sir." "By name," Blackwood confirmed. His voice carried weight. "She doesn't make such requests lightly, and neither do I grant them without considering the risk." Mercer opened the folder. Orders, transfer papers, a stamped clearance level he had never seen before. "This requires compartmentalized access," Blackwood said. "Information that doesn't exist outside of specific rooms. Information that could end your career, or hers, if mishandled. Do you understand the weight of that trust?" Mercer swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Blackwood leaned forward. "Do you? Because this isn't about tactics. This is about judgment. Captain Reed is putting her reputation on the line by asking for you. If you fail her trust, you don't just fail yourself. You take her down with you." The gravity sank like stone in Mercer's gut. He thought back to that night at Rick's, to the arrogance that had nearly humiliated him beyond recovery. And he thought of her, how easily she could have destroyed him, and how instead she had chosen to test him. "I understand, sir," he said quietly. Blackwood studied him for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "Then report Monday 600, and Lieutenant, this doesn't exist outside these walls." The building sat at the far edge of the base. Nondescript, unmarked, intentionally forgettable. To the untrained eye it looked like storage. Inside it was anything but. Mercer walked into a facility that hummed with energy. Operators moved with the kind of precision that only came from relentless training. Equipment gleamed, modified, specialized, clearly tested for scenarios beyond the standard SEAL pipeline. Simulations ran with complexity Mercer had never encountered. Reed met him in the main room, her presence as steady as ever. "Lieutenant," she said, her tone professional, "welcome to Alpha's training facility. For the next 4 weeks, you'll be integrated into our unit for specialized extraction training. What you see here falls under Compartment 7 classification. Outside these walls, this unit doesn't exist. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she said simply, then moved on. He was introduced to the others. Master Chief Blackwell, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Navarro, his former partner, whose calm precision had already earned his respect. And a half-dozen others, each radiating the quiet confidence of those who had seen and survived far more than Mercer had. From day one, the training stripped him down. This wasn't about muscle or endurance. It was about adaptation, about seeing the battlefield in ways that defied doctrine. "Rapid assessment protocols," Reed explained during the first briefing, pulling up a complex floor plan. "You don't have time to clear every room. You don't have time to run full recon. You have seconds. The question is, what do you see, what do you miss, and how do you act with incomplete information?" They ran simulations that forced him into impossible corners. Hostages chained to explosives. Communications cut mid-operation. Civilians flooding into target zones. Every scenario designed not to give him answers, but to see how he thought when answers didn't exist. By the end of the first week, Mercer was exhausted, not just physically but mentally. Every night he collapsed into bed, his mind still racing with Reed's questions. What did you assume? Why? What did you miss? And every morning he came back. One afternoon, during a rare break, Navarro sat beside him, her tone casual but edged with truth. "You know, you're the first outsider she's brought into full training in almost a year." Mercer blinked. "Why me?" Navarro smirked faintly. "That's something only she knows, but if I had to guess, because you did something rare." "What's that?" "You changed your mind when you were wrong," Navarro said simply. "Most people don't. They double down, especially operators. You didn't." The words sank deeper than Mercer expected. He thought back to that night at Rick's, to his arrogance collapsing into humiliation, to the choice he'd made afterward, to listen instead of defend, to admit instead of deny. Maybe that was why. By week 2, Reed began peeling back the curtain further. For the first time, Mercer was briefed on Operation Kingfisher, the mission that had first given her the call sign Maverick. It wasn't the sanitized story he'd heard in training. It was raw, layered, impossible. The challenge wasn't just extraction, Reed explained, pointing to the map glowing on the screen. It was extraction without ever being seen. We had diplomats trapped in a region where we weren't supposed to exist. Standard protocol called for aborting or escalating. Neither was an option. She tapped the map. So we created a third option. We used infrastructure no one thought could be used. We exploited what they couldn't imagine. And because they couldn't imagine it, we succeeded. Mercer sat frozen, absorbing every detail. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't bravado. It was calculated imagination, executed with clarity and precision. That was Maverick. By week 3, Mercer wasn't just observing. He was participating fully in scenarios, integrated into Alpha Team's rhythm. And slowly, he began to feel the shift. He wasn't chasing validation anymore. He wasn't speaking to be heard. He was listening, observing, anticipating. During one drill, Reed posed the question that tested him more than any live fire. What's your evaluation of our operational capability compared to standard SEAL teams? The room went still. Mercer knew the weight of the question. It wasn't just about tactics. It was about perception, respect, integrity. He answered carefully. Different, ma'am. Equally effective. In some scenarios, more effective because of specialized capabilities traditional units don't develop. For the first time, Reed's expression softened, just slightly. Well said, Lieutenant. The acknowledgment wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it meant more than any medal could have. On the final day of his assignment, Reed called him into her office. You've adapted well, she said. Commander Blackwood and I agree. You've demonstrated qualities that benefit joint operations, which is why I'm giving you a choice. She handed him a folder. Inside, orders, transfer options, a liaison role working directly with her unit. Mercer's chest tightened. Why me? He asked. Her answer was quiet but final. Because the most valuable operators aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who learn from them, who become better because of them. That night at Rick's, you failed. But you didn't stay there. That's rare. And it's what this unit needs. She extended her hand. The teams need officers who can question their own assumptions, Lieutenant. The question is, are you one of them? Mercer stared at her hand, the weight of the choice pressing into him. He realized then that this wasn't just about a transfer. It wasn't about career trajectory. It was about who he was becoming. And for the first time, he felt ready to answer. How heavy is the weight of silence? Mercer didn't know until he lived inside it. Alpha Team wasn't like the SEAL platoons he'd trained with. There was no boasting, no bravado, no endless chatter. Inside Reed's unit, silence carried more than words ever could. Operators moved like shadows, communicating with glances, gestures, tiny signals no outsider would even notice. And Mercer had become one of them. The transition was jarring. The first time he walked into their ready room as an official member, the atmosphere shifted. Not hostile, not welcoming either, just watchful. They were assessing him, measuring if he belonged. Navarro broke the silence with a simple, "You'll keep up." Not a question, a statement, a demand. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of training and classified missions that Mercer couldn't even acknowledge existed outside those walls. He learned quickly that everything Alpha did had stakes far beyond the battlefield. Diplomats, hostages, operations where failure didn't just mean death, it meant political collapse, international fallout, entire wars sparked from a single mistake. There was no room for error here. The first mission he deployed on, with Alpha stripped away the last remnants of his arrogance. They inserted by helo into mountainous terrain, black night pressing against their visors, rotors thundering above. The target, a remote compound where intelligence suggested a small group of foreign engineers were being held, bargaining chips in a shadow conflict no one would ever read about. The approach was silent, precise. Reed led from the front, her posture calm, movements deliberate. Mercer felt his pulse hammering in his neck, his hands slick with sweat. The breach came fast. One door, one blast, one rush into the dark. Alpha cleared like a wave of precision. Mercer moved with them, weapon up, heart pounding. Every shadow looked like a threat, every noise like an explosion. And then a hostage screamed. It was a raw, panicked sound that cut through the night. For a fraction of a second, Mercer froze. The same paralysis that had almost cost him in the compound weeks earlier. Reed's voice snapped through the comms, sharp but steady. "Focus, Lieutenant." The sound grounded him. His hands steadied, he moved. Moments later, the hostages were secured, the compound neutralized, extraction smooth. On the hello ride back, Mercer sat hunched, weapon across his lap, trying to slow his breath. Reed moved down the row, checking each hostage with the same calm presence she always carried. When she reached Mercer, she didn't speak at first, just studied him. "You froze," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am," Mercer admitted. "And then?" "I focused," he said, voice firmer now. A faint nod, "Better." She moved on. It wasn't praise, it wasn't condemnation. It was acknowledgment, and somehow it meant more than any medal. Life inside Alpha taught Mercer truths no training manual held. One evening, after a long cycle, he sat with Navarro in the gear room, both of them cleaning rifles in silence. After a while, she spoke. "You know what's different here?" Mercer looked up. "What?" "We don't train to be the best at everything. We train to be unbreakable at what matters, and we trust the rest to each other. Reed taught us that. She carries the weight so we don't all collapse under it." Mercer frowned. "How does she carry it all the time?" Navarro's hands paused on her rifle. "She doesn't. She just never lets us see when it breaks her." The thought hit him like a strike. He realized he had never once seen Reed falter, never once seen doubt in her eyes. But maybe that was the point. Maybe her strength wasn't in never feeling the weight, but in never letting it crush the team behind her. 2 weeks later, the unit deployed again. This time, the stakes were higher. A cluster of hostages in a coastal warehouse. Intelligence indicated possible execution within 24 hours. They moved at night, boats slicing through the surf. Mercer sat between Navarro and Blackwell, his stomach tight. He knew now that no matter how much he prepared, the real world always found ways to break plans. And it did. They breached. The warehouse exploded into chaos. Gunfire ricocheted through steel beams. Hostages screamed. Alpha moved with mechanical precision, cutting through resistance, securing the captives. But halfway through, an explosion rocked the far wall. Shrapnel tore through the air. One operator went down hard, bleeding, pinned. Mercer's instincts screamed at him to run toward the hostages, to stick to the mission. But Reed's voice cut through, commanding, "Lieutenant, on me." Without thinking, Mercer followed. Together, they dragged the wounded operator to cover, Reed moving with a calm efficiency that defied the chaos. She applied pressure, barked orders for extraction, and somehow still directed the rest of Alpha through comms. Mercer realized in that moment what leadership truly meant. She wasn't just saving one life. She was balancing them all, keeping the mission alive, the hostages secure, and her people breathing all at once. When the dust cleared and they exfiltrated, Mercer sat in the boat, soaked in salt water and blood, staring at Reed. She didn't look at him. She just stared at the horizon, jaw tight, eyes hard. And he wondered, what did it cost her to carry all of that? After that mission, Mercer found himself awake at night again. But this time, not from shame, from reflection. From the crushing realization that the kind of strength Reed carried wasn't something you trained for. It was something you lived through. The next morning, he caught her outside the facility, alone. "Captain," he said quietly, "how do you do it? How do you carry the weight without breaking?" She studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she said, "Who told you I don't break?" He blinked, caught off guard. "The difference isn't in breaking, Lieutenant," she said. "It's in breaking quietly, in ways that don't shatter the people who depend on you. Leadership isn't about being unshakable. It's about letting them believe you are, even when you're not." The words cut deep. They carried truth he hadn't wanted to consider. He realized then that Maverick wasn't a myth of invincibility. She was flesh and blood. She hurt. She broke. She bled. But she never let it reach her team. And maybe that was the heaviest weight of all. In the weeks that followed, Mercer stopped chasing validation entirely. He didn't need to prove himself anymore. Not to his peers. Not to Reed. Not even to himself. What mattered now was simpler, clearer. To listen more than he spoke. To see more than he assumed. To carry whatever weight he could, so she didn't have to carry it alone. For the first time in his life, Mercer began to feel not like a rookie trying to impress, but like an operator trying to serve. And in that shift, he finally began to understand why she had chosen him. Not because he was the best. Not because he was the strongest. But because he was willing to change. What makes a soldier unforgettable? Is it the medals, the missions, the stories whispered in bars long after the dust of war settles? Or is it something quieter, something most never notice until it's gone? Mercer asked himself that as he stood in the briefing room weeks later, Alpha assembled around him, the hum of the projector filling the silence. The mission before them was different, higher stakes, higher risk. Even the air in the room felt heavier. Commander Blackwood opened the session, but his words were short. Operational details fall under compartment clearance. Captain Reed will lead this brief. Reed stepped forward, calm as ever. Maps illuminated behind her. A coastal compound in hostile territory. Multiple hostages. Limited window. "Exfil is complicated," she said, her voice steady. "Primary route is compromised. Secondary route is unreliable, which means," she paused, her eyes sweeping the room, "we'll make a third." Mercer felt the words land like stone. Maverick. The plan was intricate, fragile, dependent on perfect execution. There was no margin for error. Hours later they moved, boats cutting across black water, weapons ready, every breath carrying the weight of what waited ahead. The breach came fast. Explosives thundered, walls collapsed, and chaos erupted. Alpha surged into the compound, weapons slicing through the dark. Mercer moved with them, heart pounding, instincts sharp. He wasn't the same rookie who once froze under floodlights. He was sharper now, quieter, more deliberate. But the mission turned inside out in an instant. A second detonation ripped through the eastern wall. Smoke swallowed the room. Hostages screamed. Gunfire rained down. And suddenly, Reed was gone. Not killed, not captured, just separated. The chaos split them apart, and for the first time, Alpha wavered. Mercer felt panic claw at him. Without her, they looked to one another, uncertain. No voice, no anchor. He remembered her words. Leadership isn't about rank, it's about weight. And he realized this was his weight to carry now. He snapped into motion. "Navarro with me, North Corridor. Blackwell, secure the hostages." His voice carried louder than he'd ever spoken, but steadier too. Not desperate, commanding. They moved together. For 20 blistering minutes, Mercer led. Not perfectly, not without fear, but with clarity. He adapted, recalibrated, and carried what weight he could. When they finally regrouped with Reed near the breach point, she was guiding 2 hostages herself, her movements calm despite the smoke and blood streaking her gear. She locked eyes with Mercer for a fraction of a second. No words, just a nod, subtle, almost invisible, but it said everything. "You carried it." The exfil was brutal but clean. When they finally boarded the boats, every hostage alive, every operator accounted for, Mercer collapsed against the hull, chest heaving. Reed sat across from him, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. Later, back at base, after debrief and silence, she found him alone. "You led when you had to," she said simply. Mercer swallowed. "I just did what you would have done." Her head tilted slightly. "No, you did what you had to do, that's the difference. Don't confuse imitation with leadership. You found your own weight to carry." He nodded, unable to speak. For a long moment she studied him. Then, for the first time since he had known her, she smiled, not faint, not guarded, genuine. "You'll do," she said softly. And then she walked away, her shadow folding into the silence she always carried with her. Weeks later, Mercer sat at Rick's again, not at the center, not seeking attention, just quietly nursing a drink, listening more than speaking. The bar was the same, walls lined with fading memorabilia, rookies laughing too loud, veterans sitting in corners. But something had changed. He had changed. At one point, a new batch of graduates came in, loud and proud, bragging about training evolutions as though they were combat legends. Mercer watched them, a ghost of his former self in their arrogance. One of them noticed him. "You're a SEAL, right? What's your call sign?" Mercer didn't answer right away. He thought of her, of the night she had silenced this very room with one word, of the missions she had led, the lives she had saved, the weight she carried without ever demanding acknowledgment. He smiled faintly. "Call signs don't matter," he said. "Actions do." The rookie frowned, disappointed, and turned back to his friends. Mercer sat quietly, sipping his drink, letting the moment pass. From the corner, Chief Durand caught his eye and raised his glass in a subtle toast, a silent acknowledgment. Mercer returned it. Outside, through the window, he saw her again. Captain Reed. Maverick. She moved across the lot with the same quiet presence as always, unassuming, unnoticed by most. A group of junior officers passing by straightened instinctively, sensing the weight she carried without ever knowing her story. Reed gave a faint nod, as if passing something invisible down the line. Then she vanished into the night. Mercer watched her go, a realization settling deep in his chest. Legacies aren't always written in headlines. Sometimes they're carried in silence, passed from one operator to the next, not through speeches, not through demands, but through example. And in that moment, Mercer understood the lesson she had been teaching him all along. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.